Hey, I'm Matt Geiger. My goal is to tell the full story, not the liberal story or the conservative story, and that's why I'm here to look at all the facts and give a moderate's opinion on how we can fix our immigration policy. So I broke this down into 4 parts. How do we set up the best visa system to mirror our values? Then 2 on stopping the flow of illegal immigrants. What do we do about the immigrants who are coming over our border illegally? And then what do we do about the immigrants who are overstaying their visas to remain in the country illegally? Then finally, how do we handle existing illegal immigrants who are in the US right now? So tackling that first question, how do we change our visa system to reflect the values that we have in the US? And to me, this is the most significant part because part of our lack of enforcement of our laws is this feeling that they aren't just. And I think it goes from both sides. On the left, you see it in sanctuary cities, this idea that there's currently not a fair way to get into the country. On the right, then, there's this feeling that immigrants are exploiting our entry rules and our benefit systems. So on one extreme side of the spectrum are those people who want just totally open borders, no limits. And there are actually some merits to this. So immigrants are more likely to start businesses than U.S. citizens. They're more likely to file patents. They are not more likely to commit crimes. And a lot of research even says they're less likely to commit crimes. And by the second generation, they're net contributors to the U.S. on average. And they actually contribute more than the average U.S. citizen is contributing. But there are some factors that I think make it worth limiting immigration. The first generation of immigrants actually costs more than they're contributing on average. So you're bearing that significant cost in the short term, and the economic benefits of immigration aren't uniform across everybody. New immigrants are benefiting themselves the most, obviously, but then they're benefiting people who are rich. Then after that, they're benefiting middle-class people. And then at the bottom, they're actually hurting unskilled labor, and they're hurting, most of all, the existing immigrants by depressing wages. But in my opinion, the most significant downside is the political, social, and economic instability that they can bring. And I don't think this gets talked about enough, but I think it's such a key part that you have to acknowledge it. It was actually President Obama who wrote, "When I see Mexican flags waved at pro-immigration demonstrations, I sometimes feel a flush of patriotic resentment. When I'm forced to use a translator to communicate with the guy fixing my car, I feel a certain frustration." So this video isn't about passing judgment, it's about figuring out good policy. And if the pendulum swings too far, if people feel like there are more flags waving from other countries than US flags, they're gonna end up feeling some sort of resentment towards all immigrants, and it's gonna undermine all the good that immigrants do for our country and all the good the US can do for immigrants. So I think the net impacts from immigrations is very positive, but it's important to avoid that short-term political, social, and economic system shocks that you could see pop up if it's not handled the right way. And I think a place to start is to tweak the number of entrants up or down each year so that we're targeting somewhere in the neighborhood of like 10 to 12% of the US population being immigrants. If you look at periods of animosity towards immigrants, it tends to pop when the immigrant population creeps above that level. And right now we're around 14%. When we look at who gets in, I think you need to start with people who'd contribute the most to the US while at the same time reflecting our values. The obvious people to let in are people who are educated and skilled in other countries who are looking for opportunity that their own countries either don't offer or actively suppress. These people are proportionately entrepreneurs, disproportionately represented as starting some of the largest companies, and they're economically net contributors. Google, Yahoo, Tesla, and eBay are all started by immigrants, not to mention second-generation founders like Jeff Bezos and Steve Jobs. And by the way, Steve Jobs' father immigrated from Syria. Who knows how many other Fortune 500 companies just don't even exist today because we didn't let them in. I think you need to reserve 50% of the immigration limit for these people. There's just so much potential from an economic standpoint, but this will also help topple that false narrative that immigrants are low-skilled laborers looking for handouts. After that, I think we need to honor our values as a place of opportunity for all people. I would reserve the other 50% of spots for anybody who gets in line and goes through an extensive background check. I think this is truly how most people think the system works today, to be honest with you. The only limit on this would be that no country can send more than 15% of all immigrants, in my opinion. If one immigrant group makes up too big of a chunk, I worry that you could still get those big political, social, or economic shocks, even if you limit the total number of immigrants coming in. I do want to address specifically why I'm not prioritizing some of the groups that today we do prioritize. So if you look at the groups that are granted green cards right now, the largest group by far is family. I would allow for spouses and minor children of U.S. citizens to get temporary visas while they waited their turn for permanent residency in the system that I just talked about. But I think it's a bad policy idea to prioritize all the other family preference groups that we do today. This ends up leading to specific groups being overrepresented, which leads to more systemic issues that we're trying to avoid. The economic groups that exist today in my system would probably just stay the same and expand. So I'd envision the whole H-1B temporary visa system where you have to apply for a visa and a lot of people get rejected. I'd imagine that just going away altogether. And right now we kick out a lot of international college student graduates too who are on student visas and then can't transfer that over to some other kind of visa. They would obviously be able to stay in the country too. So the existing visa lottery as it is today just seems really bizarre to me. This is like the antithesis of American values, just getting in on sheer luck. On top of that, I think the visa lottery is the part that provides this illusion that people think that anyone can just get in line for entrance to the US, even though that's 100% not true. The odds of getting picked for this visa lottery are just tiny. That visa lottery is the first thing that needs to go, in my opinion. I think it's awful. And that leaves the refugee asylum system. The definition of refugee was initially adopted from the UN. That was set as people who are scared to go back to their own country because they've been persecuted or have a fear of persecution because of their race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or membership in a social group. And I think that works in group cases, like with things the UN deals with, where you have governments or majority groups discriminating against minority groups. But on an individual basis, it's a strange definition and nearly impossible to prove. So the chance of getting one of these visas is really low and primarily depends on whether or not you have a lawyer that can argue your case well and knows the exact definition that you're trying to prove. But on top of that, it's just strange to me to put a general criteria on whose suffering matters enough to admit, especially when we're rejecting so many legitimate people suffering today. Just let everybody get in line, and this massive bureaucracy that judges an arbitrary definition will just go away altogether. If there are specific happenings in the world that we want to push to the front of the line for whatever reason, we're free to do that as they come up the same way that we handled it before 1980. Even though a true line for immigration will help by providing a legal way to get into the US, this isn't the solve for our illegal immigration problem. So what do we do about the border? The reality is any fixes at the border, more walls, more technology, more border patrol officers, do help reduce immigration to a small degree. Studies on border enforcement show great localized results, but only marginal overall results, meaning people just pick an easier way to cross. That doesn't mean it's worthless though. By increasing the cost and risk of crossing the border, at some point, we're going to shift that cost-benefit analysis so that somebody doesn't make the leap across the border to come here anymore. Lots of people are sympathetic to the hardships that an immigrant has to go through to get to the US. My feelings on that are that those sort of value calls need to be made in our policy of who gets in, not in how strongly we enforce our border. So I think we need to enforce the border regardless. So I think there is a role for walls, border patrol agents, and technology, but those factors aren't going to keep everybody out. And we're fast approaching the point where any additional cost of building walls will be the same as the long-term cost of just hiring more agents, according to researchers. So I think we're kind of at the limit now where more walls aren't going to do much good. There's private property, Indian reservations, floodplains, mountains, tunnels, and all sorts of special circumstances over the massive border with Mexico. So there's really no way that this could be our primary solution. It's just to tip the math a bit towards an immigrant not making the journey. So the solution can't be wholly or even significantly in border enforcement. So let's talk about the push and pull factors for immigrants to see if there's something there. The push is poor socioeconomic conditions and also gang and drug-related violence in the home countries. That's mostly with reference to Central America. The pull factor for Central American immigration is jobs or family. On this one, I think we can learn from the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. In that law, most undocumented immigrants were legalized, and then money was set aside for border enforcement, and employers were responsible for ensuring their employees were legal. And initially, that was thought that they were going to do that with the E-Verify system. E-Verify is a system that checks information provided by an employee against an SSA and DHS databases to confirm that it's all accurate and belongs to somebody who's allowed to work in the U.S. But before passage of that 1986 law, the E-Verify part of the bill was watered down so that employer use of the system became optional, and breaking the law altogether was only subject to a $100 or a couple $100 fine. Learning from the failures of immigration reform in 1986, E-Verify needs to be made mandatory for all employers, and when employers break the law, there needs to be real consequences in terms of larger fines. There are a handful of studies done on E-Verify, and the majority of them say that E-Verify is very effective in reducing the number of illegal immigrants. But there is one major downside of E-Verify that I think we need to talk about, and that is in cases of identity theft, which is estimated to be the case for about half of all illegal immigrants. The E-Verify system right now would just see that somebody was allowed to work in the US, and it would go ahead and approve it. So we should provide funding, I think, to use technology to identify the most common occurrences of identity theft, especially as it pertains to immigration. And there's still a ton of low-hanging fruit, like catching people working in agriculture who are over 100 years old based on the identity they're using, right? Like, obviously, that's a stolen identity. Or scrutinizing people who are working in jobs that are thousands of miles away from where they live. I fully get that catching only half of people working illegally does sound really bad, but historically the database that it's comparing against has been more concerned with accuracy and the flip side of reporting someone dead who's alive. I think it would really just take time and money to adapt those systems to a new use. E-Verify helps cover our next question too. What do we do about the immigrants who are overstaying their visas and remain in the country illegally after their visas expire? The majority of illegal immigrants actually don't enter the country over the border. They're entering legally on a temporary visa, and then just when their visa expires, they just don't leave. That's usually done through tourist visas, but you see it across a range of temporary visa types. It's not like this issue is been ignored either. They have made some headway with people who fly in, but Border Patrol agencies have basically decided that there's not a good way to track people with the border crossings when they leave the country. So that's another significant reason that you should focus on the pull factors instead of border protection. And our last question is the one that gets the most political attention. What do we do about existing illegal immigrants in the US? And this one is where it's been well established that there's no feasible way to catch and deport the over 10 million illegal immigrants in the US, nor do I think we would even want to if we could. So it's really about where the line is for how long they've been in the country, when they came over, and what level of legal residency you want to give them. These questions get a lot of focus from politicians whenever immigration bills are proposed, which makes sense, right? Because it impacts a lot of people who are currently living in the US. But I think you have to think longer term about a lot of these things. So to me, these are actually the least interesting questions because it's a one-off thing, and really it's the systemic questions that I already walked through that'll matter more in the long run. But my preference on this would be to give an interim permanent status to anybody who came to the US more than 5 years ago, which would be good to work in the US and wouldn't have any federal benefits associated with it other than the federal benefits that are already given to illegal immigrants. So that's emergency Medicaid, K-12 schooling, and WIC. After having that for 10 years, I would say an immigrant could become a permanent resident, which means that they get a green card, and that means they could also become a citizen after they've got that green card for 5 years. I think we should also forgive breaking any past immigration laws, so that's amnesty. And I fully admit this is not a perfect solution, but I think it's just reality. I want to acknowledge the downsides of it though. So on one hand, you're sort of awarding people for coming here illegally, but sending people home and making them apply the correct way is just not a realistic option. The 10-year window that I would propose is already a long time to wait to get a green card, and the intent is for that to make up for the time somebody would have had to wait to get a visa the normal way. The other huge downside is that it could actually encourage more immigrants to come here in hopes that it would happen again in the future. After all, this will be the second time that we're doing this sort of thing. We did it back in 1986 too. I think the 10 10-year wait partially helps by making this look less appealing, but the more important pieces are that E-Verify is going to stop the majority of illegal immigrants from working, and then also the creation of a legitimate way to get into the country is going to encourage people to actually wait in line instead of risking coming over illegally. Remember, in the old system, for a lot of people, there was really no way to get into the country. So here's the overall plan I think makes the most sense. You set target immigration rates equal to 10 to 12% of the population, and then you adjust how many people are admitted based on that. You completely overhaul the immigrant visa categories so that you have just two. 50% of people with degrees, skills that are in high demand, investment categories like that. And then the other part is for anybody who passes a background check and gets in a line. And then that would be with no more than 15% of all immigrants coming from any one country. Make every employer use E-Verify and give it some teeth by having fines that employers are actually going to feel and real enforcement by the federal government. Maintain funding to repair the existing border wall and hire border patrol agents in the areas that are easiest for people to sneak in. This is really just meant to be enough of a deterrence that it's not worth taking that risk. And then for immigrants who are currently in the country illegally, you'd have a special permanent work visa with very limited federal benefits. And after 10 years on that, with that visa, those immigrants can get a true green card, which ultimately means that they could get citizenship 5 years after having the green card. I think ultimately the policies of both parties have demonized immigrants, which seems both crazy and sad to me, considering everything they've contributed to our country. But on one side, the fight only seems to be around granting an endless number of immigrants citizenship as quick as possible, who have the least skills, and then give them full benefits while you're at it. But then there's this backlash to all those extreme positions by saying that we need to keep people out by reducing the number of immigrants and ramping up deportations. The irony is that both sides end up perpetuating this false view of the lazy immigrant trying to exploit our country, which is just not true. It's not about whether or not we should mortgage our country to help immigrants, which is the vibe both sides create. It's about how much immigrants and the US can both become so much stronger by allowing immigrants to realize their full potential. Thanks for watching. Hey, if you found this video interesting or useful, please give it a thumbs up, put a comment below, and subscribe to my channel to get any updates on new videos. If you didn't like it, you should probably go ahead and put a comment below too to let everybody know. Either way, thanks for watching.